And I want to apologise because what I'm going to say over the next half hour or so is going to contain a lot of appalling generalisations, which academics don't like unless they're backed by data. If you want to know why I say some of the things I say, and you want to know what the basis of the research is behind them, let me know. I mean, email or ask afterwards. It's long since I sat an exam, but when John said, would I talk about a topic to do with technological displacement, middle-class employment, political and social implications, I got that sort of, examinee's trauma. And I thought, well, the first thing you do is define your terms. Now, the title I've taken, which will indicate where I'm coming from, is Labour Power, Consumer Power, and the Degradation of Work. But I want to start by saying something about technological displacement and middle-class employment. Then I want to focus on the issues that have affected over the past 100 years or so the distribution of power in our societies, Western societies. And of course, income and wealth follow power, so I'm going to talk about income. I want to talk about the rise and fall of labour power in market sectors, private sectors. I want to talk about the potential of mobilising consumer power, not through the disruption of production, but through the mobilisation of information to protect labour standards. And then I'll end up by saying something about the political and social implications. But I can't do futurology. One of the greatest social scientists was Karl Marx, but he was absolutely crap at just saying anything about the future, and to an extent which was hilarious, was wrong on almost everything. I want to start by saying a little bit about technological displacement. And this may seem very commonplace, but it's important if you want to get where I'm coming at from the point of view of someone who's always been interested in employment. Technological innovation, as John said, has always changed work. It's created jobs, it's closed down jobs, it's shifted skills, de-skilled, re-skilled, and all the rest of it. But it's particularly rapid in our present era, of course, because the technological change has had such effects in the mobilization of information and the use of information and the contraction of distances, whether it's bulk travel or bulk transport or whatever. The technology is neutral, but the people who invest in it and use it are not neutral. And employers, by and large, seek to control employees. And that's what you do when you're an employer. They do through lots of ways. They do through creating rule structures. French sociologist Michel Crozier wrote beautifully about this 50 years ago. They create what's called, nowadays a fashionable to call algorithms about, how variables influence what you do. Development and standardization of accounting techniques. Much more effort given now to monitoring workers, CCTVs, use of sat-navs for poor people driving white vans, mobile phones being monitored and emails and all the rest of it. And then another source of controlling workers is through outsourcing. You don't have the standard employment relationship that I grew up thinking was what you had. You outsource to an agency, and a very flat hierarchy has great control. But the worker who's discontented only ever talks to the agency monkey. He never talks to the organ grinder who's creating the job. Now, all these things, all these monitoring, controlling, algorithm, etc. techniques have been greatly enhanced by technology, particularly recently. And the notion of skills, which is a skill really is something that the employer can't control. It's an area where the employee has some degree of discretion and power. And in a Weberian sense, if the employee has some control over the uncertainty confronting the employer has some degree, maybe slight, some degree of power vis-a-vis the employer. The skills have, of course, been moved a lot by these new technologies. And possibly the level of skill has been reduced, but I'm a bit hesitant about what constitutes a skill. I'd prefer to think of it in terms of power. Now, the middle class. Sorry, if I mop my eyes, it's not that I've got a sad story to tell. It's that I've got the end of a cold, so I'll just get some water. The middle class has become a term. Middle class has become a term that has become popular in the States, and so I checked on how it's defined, and apparently it's household incomes between $42,000 a year and $126,000 a year are classified as middle class income in the States, and the percentage of families of households in the States within that band, adjusted for prices, has fallen from being 61% of households in 1975 to only 50% in 2015. So the income distribution is sagging in the middle, if you like. There are more people who are very poor, and there are more people who are very rich. And you get a similar pattern, certainly in the UK and in many other countries. And this is, of course, socially problematic. My research these days is based in China, which has a very interesting labour market and a high degree of government control. And this is seen as a huge problem in China. What do you do with the rich getting richer, the new capitalists of getting richer, unless you can get the workers to get a share? You create a difficult position. And you will be aware that the French economist Piketty got a lot of publicity for his book analysing what's been happening to income distribution. And he has the driving mechanism, primarily one of the dynamics of wealth and ownership accumulation, combined with inheritance by the families, inheritance of privileged access to education and everything else that we're painfully familiar with in Britain. But I agree with others, particularly my colleague at Cambridge, Bob Rowthorne, who said that actually to explain what's been happening over the past 100 years, you have to take into account trade unions, which Piketty doesn't. Because throughout the history of the human race, the rich only ever surrender income or wealth if they're forced to do so. Sometimes by government, sometimes by their own employees. And it's been a feature of the past 100 or so years that many governments have given their employees rights to organise, to strike, and so on, which helps them to extract a share of the profits from the employers. Because the central problem is distribution. And I think this notion of displacement of white-collar employment tends to be better paid employment, which tends to have higher status and tends to be reviewed as in some sense more complex, more subtle, more demanding. A lot of it's just to do with if you pay someone more, they think they're doing a better job. And so there's a degree of social definition of middle-class employment, which I think you should take into account. There's one other point I want to touch on, which is the interaction between wages, wage levels, and labour productivity. By and large, if you force employers to pay workers more, they take them more seriously. They used to say the old Eastern European countries before they came to an end, the employer pretends to pay us, we pretend to work. By and large, if you force employers to pay more, they tend to manage their workers better, they tend to train them better, they tend to motivate them better. Slave-owning societies, famously really bad at initiating labour-saving technologies. The Greeks didn't discover wheelbarrows, for example. Why do you need to? You just need 3 slaves to do what one will do, and what one could do. And it's much cheaper to have 3 slaves than 1 wheelbarrow. And all sorts of features you notice in our emerging society now, where more and more as we become a more unequal society, you get more and more people doing. There's the return of the servant problem. And you get people who earn a living by walking dogs for their owners at very low rates of pay. I was involved with the introduction of the minimum wage in Britain, and it was a constant feature that fascinated us, was that and it's very hard to get hard data, but there's a lot of anecdotal data, as employers running, say, care homes or sandwich bars or whatever it might be, were forced to pay workers more as a result of the minimum wage, they either went out of business and had their market share taken by someone nearby who could manage the workers better, or they actually started to give thought to tightening up to make the workers more productive, which necessarily often wasn't very nice. It made them shorter lunch times and less tolerance of absenteeism and all the rest of it. So to some extent, labour productivity is driven by the employer, which most of economics 101 wouldn't tell you. Okay, that's by way of a sort of preliminary. Now I want to talk about the rise and fall of labour power. Industrialisation obviously is associated with the exploitation of economies of scale. And the costs of monitoring labour and the cost of transport encourage concentration. And if you read about, say, the textiles and clothing industry of the East End of London in the 1870s, it was very much all outsourced. Well, it went into reverse. We're now going into reverse of that. The outsourcing became inefficient when monitoring costs were high and transport costs were high. And so you get people in larger workplaces. And this provided in many countries in the West scope for trade union organisation. First around the scarcity given by the capacity for uncertainty control associated with skills, so you get skilled trade unions developing, but then just large concentrations of men and women are potentially easier to organise. And you get the development of the vertically integrated firm, the traditional firm whereby you have everyone down to the cleaner part of the same firm, which is largely lost now, particularly in the private sector. The great thing about it is vertically integrated firm, that if you can organise the workers, you can, even a segment of the workers, you can disrupt the production process quite easily, and it gives the workers considerable power. So the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century were really the high point of private sector trade unions throughout the Western world. Employers were forced to negotiate with representatives of the workers, and they negotiated over excess profits. In a perfectly competitive world, there are no excess profits, but while competition is everywhere, very little of it is perfect. And so in a world where you're dealing with imperfections of competition, you're dealing with what economists call rents, or otherwise known as excess profits. And of course, once employers start to negotiate and once workers are able to inflict costs on employers by going on strike, by disrupting production, governments stride in to give trade unions rights, to create arbitration systems, to rights to organise, rights to strike, and all the rest of it, in order to get industrial peace. So looking back on it, in the 20th century may have been in many ways a ghastly and awful century in some of its events, but it was a high period of worker power. What developed in most of the continent of Europe and to some extent in other countries was sectoral bargaining. You got agreements for the building industry, for as it might be Belgium, or for the carpet industry for Britain, or whatever it might be. These sectoral agreements were very successful. The governments connived with the fact that you were encouraging employers to collude with each other against labour, which is what employers always do, but they don't necessarily do it in a very open way. But also where labour was strong, the governments gave workers rights to collude, not only with each other to form trade unions and to withdraw their labour, but also to collude with employers, in effect, against the consumer by having an industrial agreement for all, I don't know, sailors or all painters or whatever it might be, originally in an area and then subsequently across the whole country. In that way, you got a sharing of profits sector by sector. So the more profitable sectors, like chemicals, got higher wages, and it was legally supported by the state. Now you might say, why did European countries in particular support this particular system of collusion? and to some extent, not necessarily in the immediate interest of the consumer. Well, it was very effective. It was effective in achieving industrial peace. There were bumps, but then we're dealing with a problem of redistribution. And in this society, where you're dealing with redistribution, there are going to be bumps and strikes and a degree of unhappiness at times. It was a very good way of protecting skill acquisition, because employers could, in effect, exclude employers from the agreement who were trying to be free riders and didn't train their own apprentices and so on. It had a great advantage from the employer's point of view, that it reduced the impact of unions at the workplace. The shop steward, as we call them in Britain, but the other terms in other countries, got very little traction if there was a strong industrial agreement. The balance of negotiation, the balance of the central gravity of decision-making of the union was at a higher level. Britain was an exception in having strong workplace organisation in that respect. And it led to the development of social partnership relationships, which are very much a feature of the European experiment, but also a feature of Northwest Europe more generally. So what you get emerging over the first half, particularly of the last century, is trade unions becoming really politically important operators, playing a key part in the running of or the setting up of social democrat parties, an enormously important part in first resisting the war in many countries, and then, or resisting the rise of militarism in many European countries and Japan, but also in mobilizing a war economy. And as a result, they emerge at the center of the 20th century with a high degree of political integration. And they also provide, I mean, trade unions are interesting because they provide candidates for other political office who have very strong political skills developed in the hurly-burly of trying to manage branch meetings at workplace level. And trade unions, people tend to think of them as Luddites. They generally aren't Luddites. They tend to press for interesting jobs rather than boring jobs. They tend to encourage employers to train. They tend to try to attract investment. And of course, if there are technologies that threaten their existence, and that's a separate sort of problem. But by and large, trade unions put pressure on managers to manage better. And there's, of course, a large literature around that. I want to draw a distinction between private sector trade unions and public sector trade unions. Public sector was relatively late to organize in many countries. And by and large, until later in the 20th century, the public sector unions were not very given to having strike action. That changed. And by and large, they followed the private sector. In other words, pay claims, pay settlements, pay review bodies, and all those things that fix public sector pay generally just mimicked what had happened in the private sector 2 or 3 years earlier. But public sector trade unions, of which 65% of all trade union members in Britain now work in the public sector, it's become unions are very much public. They're very different. What they aren't negotiating over rents with the employers. What they're negotiating over is basically job control. It was ever thus, and a share of taxes that the government can extract from the populace, which is very different from trying to extract a share of rents from private sector employers. Well, all this structure collapsed for the private sector in most of the Western world in the late 20th century. And the reasons are very clear, and you can demonstrate it by all sorts of econometric and other analyses. As product market competition increased, sector by sector, collective bargaining receded, its impact declined, trade union membership declined. Particularly as international product market competition increased, increased use of complex supply chains, and particularly as ownership became more international, which has been very dramatic over the past 30 years. It's very hard to run a successful private sector union. You organize a good, successful strike in your workplace or even your whole enterprise, and lo and behold, firstly, alternative things are brought in from overseas, or even worse, your owners, who happen not to be particularly British in any particular way, they just move to outsource and re-establish the plant in another country. So there's no scope for sanctions for most of private sector workers in the 20th century. And again, public sector is different because, by and large, those are monopoly sectors. So it's easier to create disruptions without such bad long-term consequences. It's still the case, however, that sorry, I should say that in the English-speaking world, for quite interesting cultural reasons to do with the nature of common law and various other things, and in Japan, what happened then was that increasingly it was moved towards what's called single employer bargaining. Enterprises, if they carried on negotiating with unions at all, would do it as single enterprises. But that's by and large degenerated into no bargaining at all. 90% of private sector workers in Britain have no bargaining whatsoever on their behalf over pay. Their pay is fixed. That's as of 2011. In Europe, northwestern Europe in particular, however, these structures of sectoral bargaining have been retained, and structures of social partnership. And in many ways, that existing system of industry-wide rates of pay, sectoral rates of pay, has continued. It's been weakened by austerity measures, particularly in Greece, Portugal, Spain, and to some extent Ireland, that it's more or less in place. And one moral one can draw from this is that in the 21st century, you can't run collective bargaining in a private sector unless governments support it. You can't rely on muscle to earn the recognition that gives you the rights. And in this case, most of my research, as I say, is on China. And since China since 2008, very interesting moves have been made to try to create something that will challenge the massively increasing private sector in China to surrender its profits to the workers who work for it. So the trade union, which is part of the government, now has 280 million members, and there's all sorts of compulsion put on people to engage in what they call collective bargaining, which is probably better called collective consultation. But it's a union, it is a single union, backed with government power, and government power in China is still, of course, very substantial. Now, even if you're in a country, as we are in the UK, that doesn't rate trade unionism very highly, there are still big social costs in poverty. Having people growing up and living in cardboard boxes has all sorts of unfortunate side effects, but particularly having them bringing up their children in the equivalent of cardboard boxes has knock-on effects with huge costs. And as in the 1890s, a major driver for the minimum wage in Britain in the 1990s was child poverty. The number of children growing up in families, by some measure, you choose it whatever you want, which are in extreme poverty. So the enforcement of minimum labour standards has become a major issue in countries which previously relied on collective bargaining just to deliver decent living standards to the employed and for those to be passed on to the less privileged workers. So we've seen the return of national minimum wages in the UK, a year or two back in Germany. So national minimum wages and the national minimum wages happen to be important in China, although as in most countries they're badly enforced. But the trouble with national minimum wages is they only apply to the least profitable sectors. If you raise the national minimum wage too high, a sort of very weak sector, like say hairdressing or hospitality, is really squeezed, as they will be hugely squeezed if George Osborne's raising of the introduction of national living wage has an effect. Then the dangers of creating job loss are very great. So minimum wages tend to be cautious, and thus they don't do nothing to spread excess profits in the richer sectors to the workers in those sectors, and they do consequently do relatively little to drive productivity growth other than in the sectors, the low-paid sectors immediately affected. I want to say a little bit about employers. Employers are, of course, hugely important and largely neglected. Western countries tend to be weak on employer organisation. That's partly because we haven't had some sort of Marxist trauma in the 19th century that made them think that there was going to be an attack on their class, which has proved to be really very helpful for employer traditions in, say, Sweden or Germany or Belgium or wherever. Most employers want to be seen as good employers. It's good for their relationships with their employees. They mostly seek stability for labour, because labour's terribly touchy. If ever you've ever tried to employ anyone, you know they're terribly temperamental. They really get their knickers in a twist if their internal pay differentials just shift out of line. You know, the more parochial the grievance, the more distressed people get. And so having collective bargaining, as they have it on the continent of Europe, has been important in keeping employer support for the existence of trade unions, albeit with much shrunken membership. Employers need to be protected from the race to the bottom. When we started going around interviewing employers for the minimum wage, they used to say, we don't mind what level you fix the minimum wage, as long as it's not above X, but please make sure it's enforced, and that, you know, they don't want to be undercut by employers. And it's going to be an interesting issue with Osborne's living wage, whether enforcement is improved more than at present. And another point I should say about legislation to support collective bargaining is tended to be driven by social democrat parties in most countries, and with a decline of those sorts of parties with a strong trade union component, that makes the sort of legislation that might support that sort of collective bargaining increasingly unlikely. So what I've tried to spell out is that the achievements of the 20th century, an era of comparative labour power in historical terms, were based on the disruption of production, which was sometimes a nuisance, but, you know, as I say, that's the nature of distributional conflict. At least it was in a sort of relatively orderly and contained way. Just bringing in ACAS is a lot easier than bringing in riot police, after all. And it was a major cause for the the decreasing inequality of income that was characteristic of most countries over the period through to the late 1970s. And it was also a major reason for a decline in degraded jobs. By degraded jobs, I just mean jobs that are unsafe or aren't accompanied by training, or which are insecure, or which, you know, zero contract hours, or whatever it might be. But those achievements are now, the means where they were attained are gone, and they won't return. They cannot return. Globalization of markets and of ownership make that sort of collective bargaining. It may cling on in Europe. In fact, I think it probably will, because it's very embedded in their democratic processes. But for the English-speaking world and elsewhere, we won't return. Because so much of the gains in information technology and in improvements in transport have made it easier to control on the part of employers and harder to make inroads on that. The third thing I want to say was about consumer power. Consumer power is really interesting, and not enough attention is given to it. But of course, if you're running a world market, then brand names have become absolutely crucial. If you're going to, you know, pour some, I don't know, Coca-Cola down you in some unsavory cafe somewhere in some corner of the world, the fact it's called Coca-Cola makes you, in some sense, trust it. So marketing has become of absolutely central importance. The spreading of information, again, is crucial. It's hard to find figures, and it depends how you measure these things, but in broad terms, if you take the Fortune top 100 firms, about 10% of their turnover is, on average, is of their value added is spent on marketing, which is about half of profits. These are very crude figures, but a lot, in other words, a lot of discretionary money is spent by large corporations on their brand name. But of course, if you rely on reputation to sell stuff, that increases the risk dependent on your reputation. If you live by brands, you die by brands. If you profit from spreading good information about your product, you really lose from adverse publicity, as Volkswagen knows. And increasingly, in a world which is where you hunt for the cheapest source, supply chains become ever more complicated. And as a result, there's a small industry risen of consumer campaigns trying to trace bad labor practices to publicly known brand names, so you can discredit the brand names in order to get at the factories with the bad labor practices. IKEA, which has done a complete turnaround, Nike, McDonald's, Apple have all had well-deserved campaigns because they've been producing in employment conditions, suppliers in employment conditions that are often dreadful. It's led to something of a revival in the international trade union confederations, mostly set up back in the 1920s. And it's led to a revival of pressure groups, like one I know is called Labour Behind the Label, which try to track down where things were actually made. And employers have responded, of course. They've responded with CSR, corporate social responsibility, sometimes called socially sustainable production, which is linked not only to labour standards in supply, things further down the supply chain, but also in environmental things, unsustainable fishing of whatever it might be, all sorts of things. And they're countering this in many ways. Many firms have voluntary audits. The big supermarket chains generally, like Asda and so on, have audits of their own. They out-commission of the factories that supply them. How many toilets per 100 workers are children allowed on the premises? All those sorts of things. You look at the websites, you can see them. Then there are independent audits, like fair trade, where people are willing to pay a premium, in effect, to have a clean conscience in eating their whatever, drinking their coffee or whatever. There are multi-party groups concerned with good labour standards. The Ethical Training Initiative is the one best known in the UK, which was set up jointly by CBI and TUC and the government. Which audits factories. And if you go to Waitrose, the onions that are sold in Waitrose will have come from an onion processing plant that will have had to pay so many £1,000s a year to have an ethical trading audit review that it's not employing illegal workers and many other things. And because this is where cheap information is really sort of come around the other way, because it's so easy now to run a campaign, blogging and all those things against a company and to attack its reputation. That the campaigns that are run against companies which make use of bad sources has become very widespread and is spreading. But don't get too excited. The scope's really very limited. In many countries of the world, if you do the necessary investigation of bad labour standards, the police or the government or the media or all three are maybe so corrupt that you end up in prison or kicked out. Employers cheat in most interesting ways, and some of the stories of how the bad jobs are just moved back along the supply chain away from the conspicuous supplier. A legion. Supply chains are very, very hard to trace. So consumer power does have some effect. It will get more important. But again, it's only on the minima. It's only on making sure that that children aren't looked after on the premises of a weaving mill or whatever it might be. It doesn't get at the sorts of redistribution of profits that have benefits for the so-called middle classes. They may prevent another Rana Plaza crisis of a factory collapsing as a result of wholesale corruption, but they won't do much to protect the middle classes. So I come to an end now. What both political and social implications? Well, if a group of employees loses power, they lose income, and they lose what is at least socially perceived of as good jobs. The technology may be neutral, but the people who control the jobs aren't, and have obviously sensible reasons for not being neutral. So it's not so much the decline of the middle classes I think we should worry about, as the decline of the political organization of the employees as a phenomenon in civil society. Trade unions are now very largely elite groups themselves, and arguably they're more of a labour aristocracy now than they were in the 1870s. I've said that 65% of trade union members in Britain are in the public sector. If you're a professional worker in Britain, the probability of your being in a union is 45%. If you're unskilled, it's 19%, and if you're a skilled tradesperson, it's only 22%. 35% of trade union members in Britain at the moment have a degree equivalent qualification, and women, who make up the majority of the trade union movement in Britain now, 57% or something, 43% of them have degree equivalent qualifications. So trade unions themselves have changed fundamentally. They certainly have none of the embeddedness in a wider society that they had 30 years ago in local government and trade through trades councils and all the other things. Indeed, in many ways, the crisis within the Labour Party is, I think, symptomatic of this extent to which it's lost touch with any sort of realistic roots, being so much in the hands of professional politicians and SPADs and all the rest of it. It means that political parties, and coming back to the theme of the project, are more divorced from reality in most Western countries than they ever were in the 20th century. There may have been a fairly rough road that we were led on with a heavily involved labour movement in the 20th century in terms of strikes, but by golly, it was effective in giving these people in the middle of the income distribution, and to some extent, to a large extent, people at the bottom, a better standard of living. And the exceptions, and I find this rather sad, the exceptions are those countries where states can see that unions do have a role as part and parcel of a social partnership. The good news, I think, is still in Northwest Europe. The sad news, in many ways, is the country I've got more and more fond of, which is China, where the unions are seen as having essentially an economic role to extract more rent from the rentiers, from the new private sector, in order to prevent the sort of inequalities arising that might give rise to the instability of the Chinese state. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Willy. One of the reasons I was very pleased that you accepted the invitation to talk is because when you look at the discourse in the technology community about employment and about the impact of automation on jobs and the rest of it, what you find is that engineers are spectacularly uninterested in and spectacularly ignorant about what work is actually like. So that was the first. So jobs are somehow some kind of abstract concept to an engineer. Okay, so and the kind of fine texture of the world of employment is really interesting, and I'm very grateful to you for bringing that out. A couple of questions to kick off with. The first is that the decline of trade unionism. You can read it as part of the agenda of what happened from the 1970s onwards in terms of neoliberalism. In other words, one of the economic crisis of the 1970s led to a radical reorientation of how companies view themselves, how they operate, and so on. And one of the preoccupations was to find ways of reducing the proportion of costs that went to labour. So you could say that the decline of trade unionism is in some way connected with a new kind of industrial philosophy. But were you implying also that the decline in that U curve that Piketty drew, where you get inequality declining radically from 1914, say, to about 1946, 50 or something, is that connected with trade unionism? Or is it connected, as Piketty says, I think, with the disruption of 2 world wars and various other things?
Well, the world wars were obviously enormously important for very good reasons. They led to the state being very, very large, and that tends to be associated with mass bureaucratization, right, steady growth of trade unions and all the rest of it. But I don't think that was responsible for the relative improvement in the wages of the weak. That owed the fact that the trade unions were, for whatever reason, given rights to organise, which enabled them to become more strong in confronting their employers.
Right. The other thing, the other trend that I think one can observe, and I think it was is Elizabeth Carnes here? Elizabeth pointed out to me that that if you were to look at the long history of the restructuring of jobs, say over the 20th century, that what you can observe in lots of areas is the continual redesign of jobs, as if somebody along the line was planning to computerize them.
Planning
to computerize them. In other words, you know, for example, the ultimate illustration of that at the moment are jobs in Amazon warehouses, right? Because it's absolutely clear that because it's almost like human robots. And it's absolutely clear that in due course the next stage is to have no human operatives at all in an Amazon warehouse, because the jobs they do have been so ultra-defined and controlled that they can then easily be automated. And is that really a general trend that we can observe across the history of employment in the 20th century?
I wouldn't have thought so, no. And after all, the term computer only entered the world in my lifetime. And but simplifying, yeah. I mean, the way you get control over employees is by routinizing, by training, by getting, you know, the more control you can get the responses, the more you can reduce the autonomy of the employee. But that's always been the case.
But doesn't that go back to, say, Ford and Taylor and
way before them.
Way before them?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, I don't know to what extent agricultural jobs were standardized in the 17th century, but I would think quite a lot.
Okay.
And there's specialization. And Adam Smith is misinterpreted in many ways, but he said many wise things, and you know, division of labour was one of them. It's interesting that one of the features that particularly the union called the GMB has campaigned for is that jobs should be more interesting, because when they've done surveys of their members, by and large, above job security and above levels of pay, people have put, we would like our job to be more interesting. But more interesting, perhaps that implies more inconvenient for the employer. I don't know.
Well, what do you think? What do you think would decide whether companies would decide to invest in new kinds of automation technology if they have relatively low-cost workers and?
Well, if you have very low-cost workers, you don't bother.
Yeah.
But if you see what Foxconn, who have 2 million employees, mostly in mainland China, a Taiwanese private family-owned company, what they say, and they make all these iPods and things, what they say is that when they've had protests against the very literally military discipline in their factories, which are very large, and associated with suicides and so on, what they say is, well, next time round we'll automate everything, because if we're going to have to pay people more, you know, either we move to produce things in Angola or Cambodia, which is what a lot of indigenous Chinese capitalists are doing, or we just automate everything. And so, yes, automation.
Okay.
It gets over a lot of human problems.
Okay. Thank you. Charles first.
So I just wanted to slightly take issue, actually, with the sort of suggestion that the trade unions can have much effect. I mean, within your and my lifetimes, though possibly not the lifetimes of some of the people in this room, the print unions were completely destroyed by technological displacement.
Yeah.
They were absolutely wiped out, and nothing that they could do made any difference to the fact that all the newspapers, all the magazines, everything completely abandoned hot metal and went straight to printing via computers.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the suggestion that trade unions can actually stand in the face of these sorts of changes, especially things that we're seeing now, which are coming even faster than those sorts of changes came, I just don't see how that's a credible position.
In that case, I didn't make myself clear. What I'm just saying that actually private sector trade unions are dying or are dead. And the print unions are very interesting, and part of their problem was they were so sectionalized and divided internally. And also they were very lucky because they had hot metal printing that lasted for about, I don't know, nearly 100 years. If you have a fixed technology, you can more or less dig in and protect your bunker. No, the print unions, they fought a in many ways, very poor, like the coal miners under Scargill. They beat a very inefficient retreat, and they died as a result. And that's what's happened to most private sector unions.
Okay, and the other sort of question or thought I wanted to raise about the political implications, which are also social implications, are what we see in the US and the UK, particularly actually in a lot of European countries. The candidacy of Donald Trump, which I think is if you look at who his supporters are, it's a sort of a displaced, white, formerly middle class, disenfranchised by the financial crash. It's a sort of raging id, which you also see in UKIP. You also see in numbers of sort of anti-immigrant, very reactionary parties in a lot of Europe. Isn't that a social implication of the technological change, which again is resistant to any idea of unions or things like that? They're simply individuals, and they're very angry about the fact that individuals.
Oh yes, I couldn't agree more. I mean, collectivism is in retreat, and the area where collectivism was politically most effective and most grassroots healthy was trade unions. But trade unions are stuffed, which is why I'm a very optimistic temperament, but I'm not optimistic about these things. And if I gave the impression that there was going to be a big revival, it'd be, well, I won't choose the analogy I was going to, but I would be misleading you.
I'd just like to thank Willy for questioning the premise in the conference question. What will happen if technologies eliminate middle-class jobs, as though technologies are inevitably the independent variable and the jobs the dependent variable. And what you're saying is there are a whole set of intervening variables that we have to look at. I think Germany is an interesting contrast with the Anglo-American setup. Because the trade unions are on the works councils, it was much less easy for companies to de-skill and degrade jobs because the craft workers remained very powerful. And the result of that has been a very healthy economy for Germany, because when machinery that's made in Germany goes wrong in Britain, there are no craftsmen left who can fix it. So you have to fly over the craftsmen from Germany, not only to install the machinery, but routinely to maintain and fix it. And there are choices to be made, discretion to be exercised as to whether to allow craft workers to act as professionals and discipline themselves and maintain their own standards, or whether to have an army of managers to do that for them. It's not necessarily always cheaper to have the army of managers and the minions below them. There are many occupations where that's actually a more expensive way of doing things, although you get more control by the employers over the labour processes you do.
Yes, I take your point and agree. I don't know whether there was an implied question, but yeah.
Well, I just wanted to agree with your question, your implicit questioning about the problem of assuming, of the thought experiment, the the logic of the thought experiment, and to suggest that we ought to be looking further into what kind of costs there are in de-skilling, which have been left out of account.
Oh, I'm sure you're right, yes, that the costings have been done on a rather short-term basis.
Professor of manufacturing called Howard Rosenbrock, who was an engineer, wrote a book called Why Engineers Design Jobs, and he was trying to bring home to engineers the fact that every time they develop production machinery, they're making value judgments about the kind of work that their workers are going to be doing. So they're not necessarily stupid about the implications of what they're doing.
I'm an engineer, I take that seriously. There was somebody here.
Yeah, it's really maybe a question for both speakers, but one of the things I found most interesting and challenging in Robert's talk was the idea that with new technologies and digital jobs and the modes of distribution of those, that we might do away with the distinction between that employee-employer relationship and a self-employment type or subcontracting or all those sorts of other types of economic relationships. And in Willy, you didn't address this head on, but one of the things you opened by saying that one of the things that successful employers have to do is control employees, and to me, that is easier maybe in that traditional employee-employer relationship, but which seems to me absolutely fundamental to everything you were saying about the nature of industrial relations in the 20th century and beyond. So, Willy, do you see that maybe that end of the employee-employer relationship as plausible? And if so, what are the ramifications in the way that you're thinking about these things?
Sorry, can you? If I see that end as
if we do away with in the future of digital jobs, as Robert was describing, there are no longer that the employer-employee relationship dies, and we all become subcontractors, like in Mechanical Turk, or self-employed, as we'd describe it in other situations. What would that future look like?
Oh, pretty depressing. One of the wonderful things about being involved with the minimum wage was that we talked to a lot of people. So I must have talked to about 6 different groups of home workers or their representatives. Home workers are these are people who assemble Christmas crackers or toys or whatever, or stitch together gloves or whatever at home because their religion or their family caring or whatever it might be. They're just exploited. It's a word I dislike using because it's so value-laden, but when you see what they have to produce and the implicit standard hours they work to and the implicit earnings that they get at the end of a week, it's appalling. And we try to get ways of enforcing standards on. I mean, not all, of course. Some home workers are, I live in a village outside Cambridge which is full of home workers who, do very nice programming jobs from home, and they have their Porsches outside the door. But for the great majority, people in isolation are and have been always very vulnerable. My granny was a cook in a stately home somewhere near Manchester in the 1900s, and she was just exploited. I mean, people become very vulnerable unless you have a state that can mobilize a democratic will to intervene in some way. And you get these strange aberrant cases. The death of the 21 Fujian workers in Morecambe Bay in 2001, was it, led to the setting up a gangmasters licensing authority. For the first time, Britain got a proper labour inspectorate. Most other countries have had them for years. But it only affects about, 0.5% of the working population. And it's actually rather robust, and they go in like policemen do and look at people's books and see them work at 5 o'clock in the morning. Now, I think the more fragmented labour becomes, the less notion of solidarity people can mobilise as a work group, let alone as a wider union. The bigger the inequalities of income will become, the greater the social disadvantage, the less access the children of the weak will have to improve themselves, and the more unpleasant our society will become. Which is clearly a worry that the Chinese have, but they're doing something about it, because of course they have a lot of power.
That's a very clear answer to the second part of my question. What would the ramifications of what happened if work became like that? But the first part, is it plausible? Do you think it might happen?
Well, I don't know. You just get new industries growing up. I mean, entertainment industry is massive, and it's to some extent collegial. I've got a nephew who does wildlife photography. He's a freelancer, but he's negotiated an agreement with the BBC for certain conditions for freelance cinematography, people going and photographing tigers at close quarters and all the rest of it. So yes, there are, and again, because of new media, that sort of informal grouping of comparing notes. I remember going to a fruit orchard. There was a pear orchard in Worcestershire for the Low Pay Commission, and they said what had really changed the way in which they treated their typically student workers was the coming of mobile phones, because they were all ringing around each other and comparing rates. So that the technology does empower to some extent people who previously would be unempowered, but often people are so dependent upon their immediate boss that they don't have the means of communication with others in a like position. Yeah.
And then we've got this technology on the other hand, on one hand, which serves the ruling elite or the centralized capital, and the labor force, which is the 90%, lacks capital, lacks education. And now, what's the utility of the technology you see in that society? I mean, we know that the heavy industry, speaking in the West, is receding. Yeah. So is it the technology is going to be more of a tool for communications, keeping the people in check, or do you see any possibilities of the centralized capital and centralized knowledge to actually spawn any other revolution which will then create another middle class? Maybe looking into back in the 19th century processes that were a bit similar to this. And so that's it.
I'm not very good at futurology, and predicting revolutions even less so. And given that revolutions rarely have the outcomes intended for them, I'd be even more nervous. I'm sorry, I'm very cautious in this respect. I find it fascinating trying to discover what on earth is happening in society, but what's going to happen next is altogether more difficult. Historians don't.
But isn't it the same as in 19th centuries and the Industrial Revolution?
Well, the answer is almost certainly no. I mean, I don't see how.
How is it different?
Well, the proximity of workers. If you don't get communities of people who have a common interest and who can feel mobilized around a common sense of grievance, I don't see how. Well, I mean, I just don't see how. I wish. Part of me would like to think that might be the case, because the story I've told you is that if you look at the sort of the history of personkind, the 20th century was a strange aberration, where for particular technological and economic circumstances, workers could mobilize in order to get a bigger share of the cake than previously. But that's over, so it's now going to shrink.
Yes, so the 20th century was abomination. It was it wouldn't go the usual way, or was it caused by the Soviet Union on the east, which would threaten the democratic states with socialist movement, and then that kind of implied the need for an equal share of revenues of the economy with the society, which would then disperse those movements?
Well, a lot of questions begged there. I mean, you know, so far as I'm concerned, anyone who says they're socialist, all it implies is that they would like to see an incrementally more equal world. Many societies that call themselves socialist aren't very equal, and many of them, and some of them, are getting more unequal as we look. I'm not sure I'm just equipped to discuss things in these rather grand, abstract terms. The life is so much more complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, it's perhaps more of a short comment than a question. It was just to, I wondered if you could reflect on whether the predictions, or not so much predictions, the comments you made about the difficulties that trade unionism as a form of social action and of social movement faces are still too focused on the experience of Europe, because the country that I work on is Egypt. Yeah. And actually Egypt has seen a very interesting revival of trade unionism from below in the run-up to and after the 2011 uprising, where you have a movement that has come up of independent trade unionism, not the state-run unions that were very much similar to the Chinese model, actually, that you described. And it's been revived through processes of collective action, of strike organising, but then turned into real organisational gains, where you actually had, at least in 2011, 2012, millions of workers, at least openly identifying with independent trade unions as a form, and tens of thousands organised on a workplace basis. It's very fragile. It didn't stop the military leading a counter-revolution and overthrowing the government of Mohamed Morsi, and the role of the trade unions in relation to the military government is complex, and in some cases they've supported what the military's done. But I think it's changed the face of labour organising in Egypt for the foreseeable future. And that has been a revival in the context of all of the uneven social and economic changes that you've described in part of the global south.
No, I think the Egyptian case is very interesting, yeah. The world history is littered with failed revolutions. Whether there will be some revival in Egypt, who knows? Elsewhere in the developing world, trade unions tend to be extremely weak, and by and large getting weaker, and extremely divided. I was recently in South Africa, and the state of the trade union movement there, which had achieved so much 25 years ago, is very distressing. The 30-odd people who were shot by the police, whatever it was, 3 years ago in the platinum mine demonstration, were members of a breakaway union from the union that in some ways moulded the end of apartheid. And none of the police who shot them have been prosecuted. And unions in the developing world tend to get mired in corruption at all sorts of levels, in all sorts of ways. And I would like to be an optimist. And I would like to think that spark that you got in Egypt will spread and develop. But there's some horrible forces arraigned against it.
Okay. On that rather grim note, we need to stop. Willy, thank you very much.